Hi, in this lecture you will learn how to handle the PLSQL exceptions. So how do we handle the exceptions? We know that while our program runs, when something unexpected happens, the execution is immediately terminated with an exception code. At that point, we need to trap the exceptions. So how do we trap it? With the exception sections. When an exception occurs, the program checks if there is any exception section in our program block. If not, the exception is raised to the caller. If there is an exception section, the program skips all the next lines and enters to the exception section directly. In here, I need to explain you something new. Exceptions can be thought as three types: predefined Oracle Server errors, non-predefined Oracle Server errors, and user-defined errors. Let's start with the predefined Oracle exceptions. We know that each exception has a unique error number and there are more than 10,000 errors in Oracle database. We cannot memorize all of them, but most of the times we face with a very little of them. So the developers of Oracle thought that it will be better to give these common ones a name so we will be able to trap these better. For example, we cannot remember that ORA-01403 is the error code of an exception that is assigned for a no data found error. So it will be easier to find them if these have some names. So they gave names for about 20 of these errors. So in the exception section, we can say that when no data found, then do these things. No need to memorize the error code. On the other hand, there are more than 10,000 error codes for the exceptions that not defined with any names. They don't have any beautiful names like no data found. We can handle these two with declaring these exceptions in the declarative section. We will see how to do that. Actually, we cannot trap the exceptions with their error codes in the exception section. So we need to declare them if they are not one of the predefined exceptions. The last exception type is the user-defined exception. Sometimes we need to raise some exceptions that not related with the Oracle server. It's about our business. For example, if the salary is greater than $20,000, then there is a problem. So raise an exception to finish the job. We need something like that sometimes in our real work. So we will learn how to do that in the next lectures. In this lecture, we will learn how to handle the Oracle's predefined exceptions. As we can see in the code sample, we trap the exceptions with the exception section. Exception section is placed right before the end keyword. It is the last part of the PLSQL block, and it is optional. You don't need to write an exception section. But if there is no exception section, the exception is propagated to the caller subprogram or platform. If you know another programming language like Java, .NET, etc., I can say that exceptions work pretty similar with the try-catch blocks. Alright, exception sections start with the exception keyword. Then we write when keyword and our exception name. This can be a predefined or user-defined exception name. Then we write then keyword. After this, we write what we want to do if this exception is captured. This is also a block. I mean, we can write many lines of code in here. This block finishes with another exception handling or with the end keyword. We can have as many exception handling blocks as we wish in here. For example, when too many rows, then do that. When no data found, then do that, and this can go on like that. But notice that even if you write a lot of exception handlers, only one of them will work. Because when the first exception is trapped, the rest of the code in the begin-end block will not run. So for example, if when no data found handler runs, the code in its block is executed, then the program finishes. The next handlers are skipped. We said that we have about 20 user-defined errors. So if we want to handle the non-predefined exceptions, we declare them in the declaration block. But sometimes we may have some exceptions that we cannot figure out. It can be anything. To handle these, we have the when others then exception handler. Like when no data found, we have the when others then handler. Means when the handlers above could not trap the exception, do these things. This handler is not specific for any error code. If the exception is not trapped by the exception handlers above, this will work in all cases. Of course, if there is an exception. If there is no exception, none of the exception handlers will not work. We can have one or multiple exception handlers. but they must be unique. I mean, there cannot be two no data found exception, for example. If you declare another exception name with the same error code of the no data found exception, you will have an error anyway. The error codes of the exception handlers must be unique in your exception section. Great. Now let's see how we handle the predefined exceptions on the examples. Here is the code that we saw in our previous lecture. When we run that, we get an error message. It says Aura minus 01403 and the error message is no data found. Now I know that I can trap that with no data found predefined exception handler. You can find all these predefined exception handlers from the Oracle's official documentation. Actually, we will use most of them in our course, but if you check them, it will be useful for you. Now, how did we understand that we have a no data found exception? With facing it, we run the code and see that we have the exception. But as a senior programmer, I could say that I fetch some data from the database into a variable. So there may be no data found exception. So I need to handle it. Then let's handle it. I simply go to one line before the end keyword and write exception keyword. Now, I will write which type of error I will trap here. It is no data found. So I simply write when no data found, then. Now in here I write what I want to do if this exception occurs. I will simply output a user-friendly message. So let me copy that and paste in here, and let's say there is no employee with the selected ID. Now let's run it. As we can see, we did not have an error this time. We see only the message that we write inside of our exception section. But did you realize something? Even if we handle the error, our hello text is not written. That means the code execution finishes when the exception section is executed. No turn back. Great. While programming in real life, we have more crowded codes. So we may face with different types of exceptions in the same block. We need to handle them all. So let's see how we handle multiple exceptions. First, let's declare a new variable. v_department name is, let's say, varchar2 and 100. Now, let's check the employee with the ID of 100. Now let's fetch the department ID of this employee into our new variable. But this time we will use the name of the employee. Let me copy paste the fetch class first. Select department ID into the department name from employees where first name is equal to v_name. Now we assume that there will be no error. So I will write a hello message with a new specific user info. So hello and our v name let's say your department IDs, and let's concatenate again, and our department name. Now let's run it. As we can see, we had an error. Exec fetch returns more than requested number of rows at the line 6. As we can see in our new fetch clause. So why? Because our query returns more than one row. Let's check it. Let me copy that and paste in here, and let's write select all the columns from employees where ID is 100. As we can see, our first name is Steven, so I write first name is equal to, let's say, Steven. So let's clear up here and run the code. As we can see, we have two employees with the name Steven. So our fetch returned an exception. We need to handle that. So let's do it. We know that these kind of exceptions are handled with the too many rows predefined handler. So we simply write, let's copy this both and paste in here. When too many rows, then, now let's print something for this. There are more than one employee with the name and our v_name variable. We can even add many lines of code in the handler blocks. So let's add a new one. Let's copy that again and paste in here. Let's say try with a different employee. Great. Now let's run it. As we can see, since there is the first name, we did not have any no data found error. But in the next line, we had the too many rows error. So we trapped that exception with the too many rows exception handler. So we gracefully exited with printing some messages. We can do any business here. It's up to you. Now, let's follow the instructions and change the employee ID. Let's clear up here and change the employee ID with 101 and run it. As we can see, no exception raised. So we successfully executed our begin end block. Can we have any more exceptions? Of course possible. Now let's change the employee ID again. Let's say 103 and clear here and run our code again. As we can see, we have another exception now, but we did not expect that exception. It raised and our program crashed. So how can we handle that? We use the when others than handler for the exceptions that we don't expect. We know that when others than traps all the exceptions that not trapped in the previous handlers. So let's add this generic exception handler. I simply copy here and paste in here and write when others then. So here will be when others then. And let's change our DBMS output. Let's say an unexpected error happened. Connect with the programmer. Let's run it again. As we can see, we handled that. This exception handler traps all the exceptions, but if the previous ones do not trap. Now let's change our employee ID to 100 again and see. See that the exception is trapped by too many rows handler. Great. Now let me show you something new. We said that we have an error number and error message. We reach these values with the SQL code and SQL-erm functions. SQL code returns the error code of the exception. SQL-erm, which is the abbreviation of SQL error message, returns the error message of our exception. Let's see how to use these in our example. Let's copy the DBMS output again and paste in here and write SQL code and concatenate with some separator. SQL ERRM. Let's run it. This exception is trapped by too many rows exception handler, so we need to change the employee ID to 103 again and clear here and run our code. We printed the error code and the error message with a separator text between them. Our error code is a negative number value and our message has a brief explanation. Where can we use these? It depends on you. For example, you can insert these error codes and messages into a log table or something. It will be very informative. One last thing for this lecture. As we have seen in all examples, when an exception occurs, our code is terminated immediately and all our job is finished. But sometimes I don't want that. If you look at that example, we can say that I want to print the employee name even if I cannot find the department ID. How can we do that? In here I cannot, because when the exception occurs in the department ID fetch, it directly jumps to the exception section. Can I prevent that? Yes. We know that an exception is written in a begin end block, and when an error occurs, it directly enters to the exception section. But the key thing in here is to the exception section that is in its block. What I mean with that? I mean, we know that a block can have another block in it, and the inner block can have its exception section too. In here, we can type our fetch clause inside an inner block and write another exception section for that. Let me show you. Let's first change our employee ID to get too many rows again. It's 100. Now, I will take our select into clause inside the begin end block. I write begin and our end keyword. Now, since we have a new begin end block, we can have an exception section here. So I simply write exception, and when too many rows, then, for example, I can assign an informative name for the department name so that we will be able to print the name at least, but with an informative error message with using department name. Let me copy the department name, and it's equal to, let's say, error in department name. Now let's run it. We have a typo in here. Let's clear up again and run the code again. As we can see, when the execution raised in our inner block, it directly trapped by its own exception section, and with this way our outer block continues running. We use that most of the times to prevent unintentional execution cuts. So this is really useful. The key point in here is every begin end block can have its own exception section, even it is an inner block. Great. Now we know how to handle the predefined exceptions in our block. So this is the end of this lecture. See you in the next lectures.